Hello, welcome to the video for what is a game what? A player who? Library books? What are we doing here? Okay, basically this video is in response to some questions I've received lately, such as, what is a game state, or the player state, or how do I make sure I do this, or how do I do that? One of the most recent ones, for example, is what's the difference between a function library and macro library, which is a good question, but also what is the best to use? And that's where the point of this video comes from. Basically, what is the best to use, or why do I use this, is a question that seems to come up a lot. And to give an honest answer, there is no correct answer. There are different ways of doing the same thing, and none of them will be necessarily right or wrong depending on the situation. One of the big stumbling blocks I've noticed that newer programmers, either programming in general or especially to a newer language like Unreal Engine, well, not a new language, but a new way of doing things like Unreal Engine, Unity, Corona, things like that, is a fear or trepidation that they're doing things wrong and that they can't do it. And a problem with that is you end up getting stuck in a spiral where if you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to actually do anything. And in my personal opinion, that isn't a very helpful way of actually doing anything. I can tell you that I did a game jam in December of 2014, which is almost a year ago from this recording. And the way my game was designed and the way the code looked is probably completely different than the most recent two jams I've done in November and October of 2015. And that's just simply because of, over time, I've learned how things work and how to better do things. And with doing these two most recent jams, I've realized that I've repeated the same mistakes a few times simply in terms of learning. Like, for example, how am I going to implement a volume control? Or how do I want to make a loading screen? And each time I try to do it completely differently or completely new so I can try to learn a new way of doing it. Because the more ways I know of doing things, the more options I have when I actually want to do it. And that's kind of the point of this. If we look through this little gameplay framework quick reference on Epic's website, you see things like, basic gameplay classes. Gameplay classes such as game mode, game state, and player state set the rules of the game and track how the game and players are progressing. You have pawns, characters, controller, player controller, AI controller, HUD, camera, game mode, game state, player state. This doesn't even cover things like game instance. Well, let me just tell you something. In my December game of last year, I had no idea what most of these things were. I started with the default third-person template, and I can tell you I did not use any of the game frameworks, game mode, game state, player state. I mean, I technically had to have a game mode because every game requires one, but it doesn't mean I changed the default one. I just used whatever Epic gave me and went from there. I can tell you my Epic game jam, it didn't use anything special. This last game I just did, I actually used game state in an attempt to learn. But I can tell you contains the state of the game, which could include things like a list of connected players, a score, where the pieces are in a chess game. This suggested example here, I can damn well tell you I did not do that. I just used game state as a universal place to do some things, as a way to learn a new method. And that's kind of the point of this. You can make a game using the default templates that Unreal gives you to start with, Epic gives you to start with, and not have to worry about any of these things. Not have to worry what is the best to use. Where should I be saving certain things? There are advantages, like for example, a game instance, which I've covered in a video, is a universal object that you can actually use to store things from level to level. So that's a good place to put things you need for that instance. A controller, for example, may be a good place to put controls. But you don't have to. If you look at the default examples that Unreal comes with, they actually put all the controller input states in the player itself, in the character. And if you look through some of the older examples, before they had things like game state and game instance, they have things all over the place. They use game modes, for example, to store a lot of their stuff. But if you're using a single-player tic-tac-toe game or a single-player Pong game, you don't need to use game mode or game state to store these things. You don't need to make this giant, decoupled monstrosity that is perfectly awesome to someone who's been programming in, C++ for 25 years. Unreal Engine is a game engine. It's meant to allow you to do stuff. And the whole point is just simply do it. Don't ask the question, what is the best to use? Just ask the question, how do I do something? Figure out how to do it and then do it. If you want to put your player's life, for example, inside the user interface, go ahead and do it. Another couple projects down the road, you may decide I want to start putting it in the character because it feels better so you can keep things separate. Maybe because your first game only has the player and you're shooting at things that don't have life. They take one hit. And then eventually maybe you'll have artificial intelligence enemies. And now you start putting the health inside the enemies because it makes more sense. And then as you progress, you will learn. There is no right answer for the most part on what is best to use. There is simply how can I do things. The HUD. You have a HUD class, which is for Slate and C++. But you can put UMG control in there if you want. You could put UMG control in the level blueprint. You can put it in the player. You can put it in this last one I tried putting it in the game state just to see if I could have my game state control if the menu's on screen and not. Just because I want to try something new. That's it. Try something new. Figure out how to do stuff. Don't ask the question, what is the best way to do stuff? Now, to answer the direct question I had, for example, like a difference between macros and functions and macros, function libraries and blueprint library. Function libraries and macro libraries. The libraries is just a universal place to put them, which I covered in my video. The difference between macros and functions are basically, functions are kind of where you're meant to do stuff. Like someone gets hit, now I need to react to getting hit, and I'm going to take some damage and play an animation and maybe spawn a particle, things like that. You're going to do something with the function. A macro is a way of just condensing a often repeated action. Like, for example, I've gone ahead and I've created two of them here. I've gone ahead and I've created the same thing in a blueprint and same thing in a function and the same thing in a macro to show some small examples. So, as an example for a function, right here I have something that's commonly done. When you get the player's character, and then every time you get it, you have to cast it to make sure it's the correct one. It's something you might do over and over. So what I did was I simply made a function called getPlayer that gets the player's character, casts that to whatever's appropriate for me, and then returns a reference to that exact type. That way, instead of these two nodes, I can only have one node. What I also did was made it pure, which is only something you can do with functions. So that way when we're actually looking at it, it's a simple one node, as opposed to get character, and then casting to generic character, and converting this to pure, which is 2. I basically just condensed it down into 1. Now this is doable in a macro form, which you can see right here. The difference is a macro cannot be pure. It's going to need an input and an output. But it's still two different ways of condensing this down into a function or a macro. Now a good use for a macro would be a repetitious thing, such as you always want to subtract 100, or you always want to, you want a number to come in, and then you want to do some manipulation of that number. You want to do a plus or a minus. You want to do some mathematic numbers, or you want to compare some things. You want to check some things. Like in the actual macro that I did here, I'm checking if the values are below a certain amount. I'm subtracting. I'm checking some variables. I'm doing some repetitious processing of numbers or variables. A macro is a good place for that because you're taking, instead of all of this information here, I'm just condensing it down to one little node. A function would work perfectly fine for that. But usually if you're not really doing anything, you don't really need a function. The function gives you extra stuff. The macros are kind of, they're just a condensed bunch of nodes. That's all a macro is for, that's the intended use for it. Now, here's the thing. You don't have to use macros. There's no best one to use. Like I just showed, you can use a macro for getting the player, and you can use a function for getting their player. They both have pluses and minuses. They both, however, achieve the same thing, and neither one of them does something unique, because right here is the exact same thing. And there's no reason I need to use functions or macros. You can just have everything inside one blueprint, and you can start using custom events for everything. There is no best to use. As you start programming, you might find that your blueprint itself is huge. And you might notice one section of it handles with taking the damage from the player. You're going to subtract some values, and then you're going to compare to see if they're still alive. So you think to yourself, well, I use that in more than one place. Let's condense that down into a function. And then, now, for example, our graph, instead of being 15 pages wide, now reads really simply as take damage, check to see if I'm still alive. If I'm still alive, then go ahead and play a recoil animation. If I end up dying, play a death animation. And it'll read a lot smoother because you've started condensing things into functions and macros. They're intended for readability and cleanliness. They are not needed. There's no best one to use. To go back to the entire point of the beginning of this, there's almost no single answer for any question in programming. And if you are a programmer or learning to program, once you understand that, you will start realizing how much fun it can be just to simply figure out ways of doing the same thing. Some of them may be more performant. Some of them may give slightly different results. Some of them you may actually turn into some form of art with your blueprint nodes. Like, I saw someone who actually put their name using blueprint nodes at the beginning of their game jam entry, and it was just really cool to look at because he expressed himself in the code itself. And that's it. That's the basics of this video. Hopefully someone got some enjoyment out of it or learned some things. I have no problem. I will answer every single question and comment I get on my YouTube channel. We have our Slack channel. If you want to join in, there's tons of people willing to help out. There are the forums. There is just basically a huge community around Unreal Engine that people will be more than willing to help you with and learning how to do things and why we might want to do things, rather than just simply, here's how you're going to do it, and here's the best way to do it, and never wavering, because that does not teach anything. That's just simply throwing an answer at someone and then moving on and not really having them learn anything. And we want to learn, and I want to help anyone who wants help. So like I said, comment below, and I hope everyone has a good day.